privilege of working with and looking after our wonderful, excellent team at Steppes Travel. Tonight, as this slide says, we're talking about the Silk Roads. I was lucky enough some 25 years ago to lead a number of trips for about 6 months up and down parts of the Silk Road. It's a time that I remember very fondly, the places that I visited, the people that I met, and I remain fascinated by the Silk Road. But I'm pleased to say, and you'll be relieved to know, that you're not having to rely on my out-of-date knowledge, but we have a more up-to-date expert, a real expert in Diana Driscoll. Diana has got some 40 slides that she's going to talk us through, and at the end we'll have some time for Q&A. Some of you very kindly sent some questions in already. Thank you very much for that. But as we're going, as Diana's talking, or indeed at the end, please use the Q&A or chat to ask any questions that you might have. Now, in my travels, I've been lucky enough to meet some extraordinary people, some wonderful guides, some great storytellers, and amongst those, I'm pleased to include Diana. Diana studied at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, and then having finished there, she was Deputy Registrar there for a number of years, and then was seconded to the British Council in Hong Kong. And that's when she used her time there to make excursions into the mainland and onto the Silk Road, complementing trips she'd already made in Central Asia, in India and Iran. Diana works now at the Asia Department at the British Museum, where she lectures on the Silk Road and on Islamic architecture. She's led a number of trips in Morocco, Uzbekistan, in Iran. And I'm pleased to say that over the last 3 years, she's led excellent, hugely successful trips with us, Steppes Travel, along the Silk Road. And next year, she's leading a trip with us to Pakistan. So Diana, we're very lucky to have you here tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to hand over to Diana Driscoll.
Thank you very much, Justin. Thank you. And welcome everybody to the next, hopefully 14 minutes on the Silk Road. Maybe a journey that many of you have taken. Hopefully you remember some of the wonderful things that you saw there and some of the marvelous people that you met, both from the past and hopefully from the groups you were on. One of the things I find very interesting about the Silk Road is a question. I've always had a question. And the question I always had is, why did humans travel to vast spaces, through vast spaces of land in an alien world ages ago? Why did they do that? How do they interconnect with other cultures, other people, cities? How did it change their worldview when they went back home? How did it change the countries and the people that they connected with? And that's why I think the Silk Road, or roads, is very important to study and to look at, especially the history of the whole Silk Road, which will take you basically for 3,000 years. 3,000 years. Now I'm going to try doing this by, okay, I see, up and down. Nadia, I can't get it to move.
Left and right.
How do I get it to move?
Left and right
Left.
arrows.
There we go. Did you do that or did I do that?
I did it.
Maybe, okay.
I can carry on for you.
Okay, and I'll tell you when. All right.
Okay.
Okay, let's start. Let Nadia do the technicians, because obviously I even changed the batteries in my remote control thing. Anyway, that's technology for you. The Silk Road. The Silk Road, as we know, was the first global highway. It was a network of commercial land roads that stretched basically from Xian in China all the way to Constantinople and into Rome. And it stretched through 5,000 miles, 5,000 miles. And it covered 3,000 years of history. That's a long time. Now, today we're going to look at the Silk Road through two different lands because it's so vast and it's so long. I thought we should concentrate a bit. I'm going to look at the West and the East. I'm going to look at China, Xian, which was once known as Chang'an, and we're going to go all the way to Rome, but we're basically going to stop pretty much in Samarkand. And we're going to look at Central Asia and China because that's quite enough to take in. But that big red line that goes through that map is what we're going to follow. And I'm going to take you hopefully on that road in the next half hour so you can experience some of the things that I've experienced on the Silk Road. Next, to the north of this, let's see, okay, to the north of this, it's one thing to do is to look at the geography of the Silk Road. To the north of that red line, which is where all the cities run, was the Eurasian Steppe. And the steppe is vast. The steppe goes from Manchuria all the way to the gates of Vienna, to the Hungaric plains. It goes from Siberia in the north to the Silk Road cities itself, and it's called the steppe lands. And the steppe lands are a sea of grass as far as the eye can see. There's hardly any rain. It's very barren in places, and it was almost uninhabited, except by nomadic tribes that came through. And every so often, these tribes, next slide, yeah, every so often these tribes would band together and they would raid the caravans or they'd raid the urban centers. And we know about them not from themselves. They never wrote their own history, but other people wrote about them. The Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Chinese. And what's interesting, they all gave the same exact stereotype idea of these nomadic people. Give you an idea. They raped, pillaged, sacked, burned, beheaded. They were described as poor, greedy barbarians. Now, a barbarian is somebody who has no language and has no comprehension of anything. Their language is ba, 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 and therefore the Greeks called them barbarians. And the Romans said they were possibly not even human. Anyway, the next slide. These barbarians, these nomadic horsemen, were basically three types. They were the Scythians, the Turks, and the Mongolians. And the three groups that came from the north and emigrated at some point into what we're going to look at on the Silk Road today. Now, many of you may have been to the British Museum a couple of years ago to the Scythian exhibition. And the Scythians were the very early raiders that came from the north. And they were around until about the 2nd century BC. Then the Turks migrated slowly, 8th to 11th century. And of course, Genghis Khan, the Mongolians, came from the 12th to the 14th century. Now, there were three different groups of people. They spoke three different languages, but they had things in common. And what they had in common was the fact that they were fantastic horsemen. And they were warriors. And they could travel 400 kilometers in 24 hours on a horse. 400 kilometers in 24 hours. And they were mounted deadly warriors. Next slide. Next, Nadia. Thank you. I think if I just do a high sign or something. Anyway, the Scythian burials. Now, the burials are almost all the same. That's the other thing they have in common. And this is a wonderful picture of the Scythian burials from the 4th century BC. There's your warrior on the right. And the warrior would be buried with his horses. The horses were very sacred. The horses were draped in all their finery. And around him, he probably also had some of his best warriors. And these men were buried, and 15 to 20% of them were women. Women warriors. So when Herodotus talks about the Amazons, he's talking about some of these women warriors from the steppes. So these warriors had these fantastic burials, and probably Genghis Khan, when he died in the 14th century, he would also be taken to the steppe and buried with his 50 most closest warriors and his horses. Next, please. Next, right. This south of this red line that we saw is the Gobi, is the Great Deserts. So the Great Deserts are 4 that go from China to Turkmenistan. The Gobi, the Taxila Pakistan, which is both in China, the Karakum, which is basically around Uzbekistan, and the Kizilkum. And again, these are the great desert areas, and they're very treacherous. There's no water, there's hardly any rainfall, it's cold, it's hot. And those of you who've been with me know how hot it can be in the Taxila Pakistan desert. The Taxila Pakistan is where we're going to visit quite a lot today, because the Taxila Pakistan is a desert that anyone who goes into it never comes out of. That's how awful it was, its reputation. Next, the caravans. Everybody loves a caravan. Everybody loves a camel. I don't know why. They're fairly disgusting creatures sometimes. But the caravans, we don't know much about the caravans. No one actually wrote. None of these people on the caravans left much behind. But we do have some records. And some of the records tells us that the caravans could be very small, consisting of only 40 people, 6 donkeys and a horse. Or they could be huge, 300 camels with 4,000 bolts of silk. So depending upon the terrain, you had to have different animals. Camels can go on the sand, but camels can't go over mountains. So over the mountains, you have to have your donkeys, horses, and in some areas, even a yak. So the caravans carried various things. They carried commodities. Next slide, please. The commodities that they had are some things that we know about. On the top, you have 2 pieces of silk. Silk was the one commodity that really traveled quite a bit. It was very light. It was quite precious. You could pay your armies with it. And the armies could use it in marketplaces. Animals, exotic animals. The more exotic, the more expensive. Porcelain, and of course, melons, cosmetics, fruits, vegetables, you name it, it came on the Silk Road. Anything what was tangible and could be carried, it ended up on the Silk Road. But there also were intangibles on the Silk Road. Ideas, religions, philosophies. Next, please. The most important thing on the Silk Road were religions, in my opinion. 6 of the greatest religions in history were at some point on the Silk Road. The Zoroastrians, today the Parsi community. Zoroastrians were there from the time of the 6th century BC. Nestorian Christianity, that group that broke away from Orthodox Christianity, ended up in China. Judaism, a lot of Jewish merchants. We found some of their documents. And a lot of the Jewish merchants were the bankers for the Persian Empire. They never really went back to Babylon. A lot of them stayed up and became very famous bankers throughout Persian history. Manichaeism, a small group that took off. Manichaeists were the Uyghur Empire. The Uyghurs were Manichaeists, I think, just to annoy the Tang. And Buddhism, of course, is one of the most famous that came through, because that footprint that came up from India went straight north and it went eastward into China, not really westward. And of course, the last group that came was Islam in the 7th century. Next, please. And there were travelers, the travelers on the Silk Road. Okay, some of the famous travelers that we know from the Silk Road. Now we're going to meet some of these people in the next 30 minutes, but the top three were Buddhist monks. The top person was an ambassador that we'll meet very shortly. The next two are Buddhist monks. Look at the names of these people. We had merchants, we had ambassadors, we had Marco Polo, of course, and we also had Franciscans and Jesuits. And they all came at various times for various reasons. Right, and onward we go, Nadia. Next. Some of the oasis cities that they would go through are now destroyed. And this is Johe. And this was a great Buddhist center. And in this city would be in the desert, a desert oasis city, no longer there. And from Johe, you would go probably cross into Kashgar, and there would be a great split in the roads. Next, please. Next. And you would stay in places like a caravanserai if you were fortunate enough to be there. Caravanserais were not only there for the caravans, they were also there probably for other uses. They could have been hunting lodges, they could have been monasteries used at various times, but the groups would come through here, the caravans would come through, they would change their goods, they would change their animals, like this one in Kyrgyzstan, in order to go up north. And they would go to the city up north from here, which is the next slide. Next. Balasagan. Balasagan is very far north in Kyrgyzstan, very close to Kazakhstan. And I think from here, you'd have nomadic people coming down and trading Siberian furs that would therefore be taken down to Kashgar and into other cities on the Silk Road. But this early city was inhabited by various people until probably about, but we found ruins in here going back to Zoroastrian, Nestorian, and even some Buddhist little amulets were found in this area, which just shows how religions were all over the place. Next, so where did it all begin? And now we're going to start the story of the Silk Road. Where did it begin? Well, what's very interesting is that in the 5th century BC, in the markets of Greece was this strange sort of fabric that came. And it was so beautiful and so expensive that they would cut out a little tiny piece, like a brooch, and they would pin it to their toga. Alexander the Great. Everyone knows how much I love Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great leaves Macedonia and he's going to find he's going to go eastward to find the great ocean and conquer the world. He's a world conqueror. And on your screen, we have a coin with Alexander the Great, a wonderful profile. Look at that lovely, lovely face. And he's got his horns. Now, the ram's horns are from Amun-Ra. That shows that he is a god. Now, his mother told him that his father was not actually Philip, but the mother, that actually his father was Zeus. And as we know, Zeus made met various women at various times. So this young man really didn't have a chance if your mother keeps telling you that you're a god all your life. And off he went, and he ended up in a city called Afresiab. Now, what's interesting is in his memoirs, or was written that he arrived here in 329 BC. And he found the city of Afresiab, which you can visit today, and you can walk on the walls of Afresiab. It's now called Samarkand, and it's just north of Samarkand, very close. And Alexander wrote, "Everything I have heard about the beauty of the city is indeed true, except it is more beautiful than I imagined." So the Greeks knew there was great wealth and beauty beyond the Oxus River. And it is through here that he married his wife, Roxanne. And Afresiab has become one of the very important cities of the Silk Road and the early Silk Road. Next slide, please. Alexander doesn't stay long. He leaves and he goes into Pakistan, northwest Pakistan. And I wanted to show you this just to show you that at the time he was there, he goes into Taxila, which is on our, which is one of the places we'll visit in Pakistan, which was a great Buddhist center later on, not when he was there, but when he's there, he says he meets people who are Hindus and Buddhists, which is very interesting. And then he leaves. But what's there today are these great Buddhist stupa. Okay, now let's start our journey. So this is the Silk Road, and we're going to look at 3 periods of the Silk Road. Next slide, please. And these are 3 periods I'm going to look at because these are 3 periods of prosperity. And these are the three things that when you go on the Silk Road and you see the different cities, that you're going to look at these different periods and things have happened. So we're going to look at China in the west, east, and we're going to look at the west, Rome, and then basically into Central Asia. So the first period I want to look at is the first period of prosperity, which is Han China, 200 BC to about 200 AD. Next, please. Now, what's happening in China? China is the Han Dynasty. Emperor Wu is having trouble with those dreadful steppe people in the north that the Chinese call the Shinu. Now the Shinu also had a small word they called them, which were Huns, Huai. So the Huns, we'll call them the Huns at the moment. And he's fed up with his Huns because it's really depleting the treasury of China. He's giving them gifts. And the gifts are, if you do not pillage the cities in northern China, and if you would please not invade after we take in the grain, I will give you silk. And so they were sort of bought off with bolts of silk. And of course, these nomadic people loved their silk. They didn't just live in a yurt in the middle of nowhere. They were dripping in great, beautiful fabrics inside their dwellings. And the other thing they liked very much was Chinese princesses. And we have a surfeit of Chinese princesses, which is another way to pay off your nomadic people. So Wu decides what he's going to do is to send an envoy out to the west, to the western regions, and he's going to send Zhang Xian. So Zhang Xian goes out to the west because Emperor Wu tells him there's allies out there, and these allies will come back and they'll help us take out the nomadic people in the north. And of course, they tried doing the Great Wall. China was built a little bit before this. Didn't keep anybody out. So anyway, John takes off. He has a 13-year journey because he's captured along the way, but he always has his ambassadorial yak tail. And there he is holding his yak tail in his right hand. And I always love these statues in China. They all look like they're rugby players. Nice, big, strong men. They probably were not quite that big, but good men. He goes off, goes to Uzbekistan, ends up in the Fergana Valley, and what does he find? Horses, not Mongolian ponies. He finds war horses. He finds horses, square snouts, short ears, big, big chests, and huge rumps. These horses are 12 or 13 hands high. He knows that those horses could change warfare in China. And so they do. So Zhang goes back to China and he brings with him at one point 3,000 horses. I don't know if many of them ever made it because getting across that desert would be very difficult. So anyway, the horses went east, and Emperor Wu was really excited about the horse, and the horse became a very important commodity on the Silk Road because it could be traded for what else? Bolts of silk. So a good horse could cost 28 to 38 bolts of silk. one horse. And in one transaction we have later on, 100,000 horses went to China. And the Chinese were importing horses up to the Ming Dynasty. And basically, even though we're talking about 138 BC, that until the Ming, which is 1600, what is happening in the steppes? The steppe people are now deciding to breed horses in order to sell them. Now, a good horse, as I said, was 28 to 32 bolts of silk, but also a top grade horse would go for a Chinese princess. So if you were a Khan out in the steppe land and you wanted to not only have silk in your yurt, but you want to have a fragrant princess, she would cost you a mere 3,000 horses. Next slide, please. Okay, Nadia, right. So this is where the story of silk actually begins, because at this time, horses go to the east, and also in the Romans are now dealing with more and more silk, and it's quite expensive, hugely expensive. Matter of fact, silk and pearls are the one thing that the Romans really want, but someone is controlling that trade route between Rome and the source of the pearls and the silks. And of course they're stopped. They don't go very much further than Iraq today, the Euphrates, Tigris and Euphrates River. That's the end of the Roman boundaries, as it were, because on the other side, there were the Persians, who were great traders also. And these Persians also were not going to let the Romans take their commodities away. So the Romans were dripping in pearls. If you go to the British Museum or other museums and you look at Roman statues, they all are wearing pearls. And the other thing they loved, of course, was silk. And this is this wonderful, wonderful mosaic from the 2nd century AD, which Seneca the Elder was horrified that young women in Rome were running around in silk dresses that were so sheer you could see all their body underneath. And here's this fabulous mosaic demonstrating a young woman having a rather good time, having a little bit of a Roman rave. Next slide. So the Romans wanted pearls and the Romans wanted silk. But what did the Chinese want? Well, they wanted gold and they wanted glass. So the one thing for all the periods, from the time of Rome all the way till the Ming Dynasty and beyond, to the Ming Dynasty, was glass. Marco Polo, Venetian, was giving glass, Venetian glass. Somehow the Chinese never got the hang of making glass, but they wanted gold. And this was, again, draining the coffers of Rome. So the two goods were going on, but who were the people who were the traders? Next, please. During the time of the Han Dynasty, who were the traders? They were the Sogdians. Remember Alexander the Great? He goes to Afresiab, he marries Roxanne, she's a Sogdian. The great Sogdians were the middlemen of the Silk Road. The Sogdians were all over the Silk Road during this time. Matter of fact, their footprints are everywhere. Their major port was in Samarkand. They went from Samarkand to Kyrgyzstan, where we saw Balochistan, to Kashgar. They were in Dunhuan, in Xian, in China. They emerged from history, and they suddenly are fully in control of the entire Silk Road. And they were in control up to the time of the first and second times of prosperity. They were also the middlemen for the Turks in the north. There were Turkish tribes in the north who also wanted to deal with Byzantium. And they were the middlemen for the Turks, the Turk Khans. And they never formed an empire. They never formed an empire. They formed things like Venetian city-states. And the wonderful thing about finding some of these old cities is the frescoes on the wall. And the frescoes tell us everything about the Sogdians. Here we have this banquet. They loved banquets. They sat on lovely cushions. They wore fantastic fabrics. They were dripping in pearls. All those little white spots around are pearls. On their necks are pearls. And their earrings are pearls. Pearls are on their belts. The belt is very important. Laden with pearls and sapphires and rubies. And one of the Chinese visitors that goes to Samarkand made the following observation about the Sogdians. He said, all the inhabitants of Samarkand were brought up to be traders. Mothers gave their infants sugar to eat and put paste in the palms of their hands in the hope that they would grow up, they would talk sweetly, and that money would stick to their hands. From the age of 5, young men were taught various languages, mathematics, weights, measures in different countries. You needed all the different weights you had to know. And then they were sent out to study business. And then they were let loose on the Silk Road. So they were the middlemen. They were the Lehman brothers of this vast empire. They went from that the commodities they brought from Byzantium to China, from China back to Byzantium. They were highly cultivated. They were highly tolerant of all religions. They lived in sumptuous city-states. They never formed an empire. They were merchants. They never left their histories. They left receipts. And they also left 5 letters that were found in Donghuan. That tells us quite a bit about what was happening in the 3rd century AD. They were the providers of all the silk of that period. Now we're going to go on a bit further to the next period. Next slide, please. Next slide. Ooh. Nadia? Oh, there's one of the Sogdian homes, the lovely frescoes on the walls. It tells us all about how they lived and how they worship. Next slide, please. Right, the next period. This is period 2. And we're going to stay with the Sogdians because they're still active. But things are happening. Things are happening from about 300 AD onward. We found these letters that tells us that there's disruption in China. The Han Dynasty is gone. There are various sort of other warring states that take over, 3 or 4 different dynasties. It's hard to trade. They're losing money. Sometimes the caravans are being raided. It's not a very good time. But from about 800, we have the Tang Dynasty, 7th to the 10th century, the Tang. They consolidate China again. And once again, the Silk Road becomes the second time of prosperity. And I want to show you these 2 images that demonstrate this prosperity. The camel. The camel, on top of the camel are musicians. The Tang loved musicians. The Tang loved exotic animals. The Tang loved beautiful objects. Anything that you could bring them, they would buy. And one of the things they really loved was musicians. Now, these musicians are definitely not Chinese. They're definitely Central Asians. Look at the beards. Look at their clothing. Look at their hats. Look at what they're sitting on. That camel blanket is probably made out of felt. A lot of felt you find in the steppe lands. Of course, Kyrgyzstan, a lot of felt is made in Kyrgyzstan today. So that striped motif, that striped fabric is very, very Central Asian. And also the doll next to him. Now, that doll when it was in New York, they called her the same height as a Barbie doll, but she's much more interesting because look at her hairdo, very Tang. Tang ladies like to have this Mickey Mouse ears sort of hairstyles. And across their forehead, they have this lotus painted with cosmetics. The moth eyebrows, the cute red lips. But what is she wearing? It's not Chinese. It's from Central Asia. She's wearing the bodice with those little circles around, two griffiths looking at each other, and around them are pearls. She's wearing a belt made with pearls. She has a silk skirt in stripes that matches the stripes of the camel. In her arms are made out of a piece of paper. And the piece of paper is a pawn receipt. And the pawn receipt is from Chang'an, and it's been canceled. And it's been rolled up, and it now is her arm. Very Central Asian, but she's a beauty because she's the height of fashion. Next, please. Okay, next slide. Nadia, next slide.
Yeah, it just
Next
takes
slide.
a few seconds to it just takes a few seconds to show.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to try and give it back to me? See if I can do it?
Okay.
Okay, let's see if it works.
Just giving you the control.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Isn't that funny? It's just not working. Not working. No, you'll have to keep it. You'll have to keep it. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just take it back.
Okay, we're going to go on the Silk Road now. We're going to leave Xian. We're going to leave Xian and we're going to go to the Western region. And we're going to do this through the gates of Chang'an. And there's the ancient wall of Xian today. Now this wall is 14th century. The wall that was there when John left would not have been only 14 kilometers, it would have been 25 kilometers. There would have been 12 gates, 3 lanes, 3 major lanes going through Xian that were 8 meters wide so that your caravans could get through. There were 4 Zoroastrian temples found in ancient Xian. There were a Nestorian temple found there. There were Buddhist shrines found there at various times through the city. Why? Because they were interested in religions. The Taoists were not very keen on them, but they were there. And the other thing that's important, that if a merchant died, the Chinese could confiscate all their property unless it was claimed. So therefore, they had to have communities in these various cities to make sure that their merchandise was not claimed by the Chinese. And the other thing that's in the middle of Xian is the statue to Zhuangjiang, who's this wonderful, wonderful monk who went on the Silk Road into India. It took him something like 13 years, monastic handbooks, and bring them back to Xian. And the Wild Goose Pagoda behind him was actually not a pagoda that we know, that was his translation house. So translating from Sanskrit into Chinese was very, very important. And bringing these sacred manuscripts back was also very important. And he has saved many of the Buddhist sutras, was saved by this monk in the 7th century. Next, please. So we're going to leave and go on to the Silk Road. Now, the last place you would have left through would be through this fort, the Jianyuan Fort. Now, it didn't look like that at that time, but this was the furthest you could go. This was the end of the Chinese Empire. Beyond that was the Western region, the place that no one wanted to go to. If you were in exile and you were sent out and you displeased the emperor for some reason, you'd be sent out from these gates into the Taklamakan desert. And it was through these gates that many monks and the caravans left to go to the West. And in the West were the objects they brought with them. And when you went westward, you would end up at various cities. One of the cities would have been Donghuan. Next. Okay, Dunhuan, 4th to the 14th century. It's known today for its almost 500 Buddhist caves. But what's significant about Dunhuan was not just the Buddhist community that was there, but it's what's on the walls of those frescoes, those caves. There are lots of them that have to do with Buddha itself and the Jatakas, the stories of his life. But there was also pictures of what life was like in Xian. We have no palaces left over, but we do have these frescoes on the walls, and it shows us how people lived. They show us their gardens, their palaces, their homes. They show us the vegetation. They show us the animals they had. They show us the donors. So, and also in Dunhuan is where Arl Stein in 1900 found the great catch of manuscripts that tells us so much about religions, languages, commodities on the Silk Road. The other place you would stop at would be another Buddhist center, and that is in Bezelik, the Bezelik caves. Next, please. Very famous also, but much more famous because not just of the caves itself, but again, who's on the walls. Here we have the Uyghur princes. The Uyghur was a great empire in the north. The Tibetan Empire was in the south of the Taklamakan Desert, and they came down very hard on Dynasty. Tangs had a difficult time with the Uyghurs and the Tibetans. But of course, in many of these caves, we can't see some of these because we're rewriting history a bit, or the Chinese are. But they show us who these people were, what they wore, and how important they were, because they would make the caves. They would give the money to the Buddhists to do the caves so that the monks would pray for them. They would pray for their prosperity. They would pray for their health. They would pray that when they died, they would reach nirvana. So it's basically a religious center, not only for the monks, but also a place of pilgrimage. And those are the very famous people that came through the Silk Road. Next, as we go on further through the Silk Road, we go through Kashgar and we end up in the last of the caravanserais. Again, a wonderful brick building, because this is before, and then from this, we're going to go now into Central Asia. What was happening in Central Asia during the time of the Tang, or even before? And this is the time when Islam is coming up. Islam comes up from the 7th century, sweeps through almost to the doors of Constantinople, not quite though, banishes the Persians, the Seythians, and they leave. And they go up to the Oxus River, and the great merchants, the Sogdians, no way want to have anything to do with these stupid Arabs, because they were. And they were not, they were crass and coarse. And of course, these merchants have a lot of wealth, and they didn't want to have the Arabs and their ragtag army, because it wasn't an Arab army, it was a mercenary army, and they were out for booty, as any army would be in those days. Next, please. And what happened after the Arabs came into Central Asia is a Persian dynasty called the Samanids. And the Samanids are Persians. They're not Arab, they're Persian. The Samanids are great administrators. The Samanids are merchants, and they're going to be artisans, and they know what the Chinese want, and they're going to make glass and send glass to the Chinese. And they're going to bring back the great silks, And they're going to send the melons down to the sultans down in Damascus. And they're going to build their own great city called Bukhara, and a great university city also. And people like Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi, philosophers, religious theologians, come to this city. And this city not only is intellectually one of the great cities of the Arab world, but they built wonderful buildings. And this is the time that we find the Islamic world is now going to start building their own buildings. And this is a wonderful building. This building is made out of brick, and it's in Bukhara. Next, please. And all over this building are wonderful symbols that are not just Islamic. It shows how art and architecture is like a magpie. And here we have symbols on it. Symbols that are Zoroastrian symbols and symbols that are Buddhist symbols. And they're all putting them together. And what's fascinating, that door that you see before you, is going to be changed in the next period of prosperity. It's going to be changed by the artists and artisans in the Mongolian, post-Mongolian period. And that's the earliest part of the Islamic world here in Bukhara. Next slide, please. But all made from mud brick, because that's what they had. And we're now looking at the art and architecture of the Eastern Islamic world, not Morocco, not the Levant, the Eastern Islamic world, where they had sand, and they're building things from sand. And in Central Asia now, you'll have buildings are going to be built that we will be able to visit today. And one of the great ones are these brick buildings. And that minaret is terribly important because, again, it's a symbol. When you had caravans on those great Silk roads, they were going to cities, and they were probably like lighthouses, lit up by flame in the top. So the caravans had a place they knew they were going to. They wouldn't get lost. Those brick buildings would one day not just be brick, they would be covered in tiles. Next, please. And this leads me to our next great period of prosperity, the Mongolians. Everyone loves Genghis Khan. You can read about Genghis Khan some other time. We're not going to talk about Genghis Khan, but we do a little bit. Genghis Khan comes in 1220, and he pillages basically Central Asia, into Kurdistan, down into Persia. He dies as a great nomadic warrior. We have no idea where his grave is today. He was taken away by his 50 most, his closest warriors, and he's buried someplace in the steppe, probably someplace around Ulaanbaatar today. He leaves behind a huge empire, which is divided into 4 parts. And the one part that we're going to look at now is the part that is going to be built by the last of the nomadic warriors, which is Timur Ilenk, Timur the Lame. And he's going to build the great city of Samarkand. Now, he's basically probably Turk. He's not pure Mongolian. But of course, it's very important for him and for people to say that this is a Khan. This is the Khan. And the Khan, like Genghis Khan, is going to be rule over a huge empire. And he rampages all over the place, trying to build his empire like Genghis Khan. But unfortunately, he dies before this happens. But what he does do is he takes not one Gennesid wife, but 4. And he's going to build the city of Samarkand. And what he's going to do, next slide, please. He's going to take all of his goods, and he's going to bring all these artisans here to Samarkand. And Samarkand will now not just become a market town, and probably it was a very important Sogdian town also, but he's going to build it, and he's going to make it great. He's going to make huge buildings to reflect him and his colossal ego. And one of the things they do have, I said, is tiles. Now, I'm only showing this one piece of tile because it's a mosaic tile. It's not a painted tile, it's a mosaic tile. Little pieces like a puzzle has been put together. It would take 5 men, 5 days to make 1 square meter. Next slide, please. And now we're going to see who built the city of Samarkand. And this is a most amazing manuscript that tells us who they were. Now, the man in the red, holding the big stick, he's our Ustad. He's the person who's in charge of the building of, this is going to be the building of a great mosque. But all over this are all these different men. And they're from various parts of the empire. They're from Damascus, from Izmir, they're from Persia, they're from India, and they've all been brought here by Timur to build his city. And here we see all the people's faces. Each face is different, each hat is different, each piece of clothing is different. This manuscript is telling us who the people are who built the city of Samarkand. They're from all over the world that he knew at the time. And into this city came an ambassador. And his name, he was from Spain. And he was sent by the Spanish to the east to find an ally, because the Europeans were very worried about Islam. It made them very nervous, and they were hoping that they could find a mythical king called Pastor John, who supposedly was a great Christian king, and he would be their ally and maybe help them keep Islam out of Christian Europe. They're very worried about these things, as they would be. But anyway, he comes to, Roy de Clavejo comes to Samarkand in 1402. He stays for 3 years. Next, please. And he tells us in his diaries what he saw in Samarkand. And he said it was a vast city with mosques, madrasas, mausoleums, caravanserais, vaulted bazaars, gardens. There were 8 gardens, huge gardens, 1 mile square each garden around Samarkand. None exist today. Numerous palaces and houses. And he says the palaces were hung with fine silks and tapestries. There were verdant gardens, wild drinking parties. It wasn't a good party unless everybody went home completely besotted. Built within 20 days, and everything was colossal. Stupendous, magnificent, all covered in mosaic tiles. The domes are rising 50 meters high. The kufik on the drums is 10 meters high. You're like an ant next to this enormous portal. Next, please. So this was the city of Samarkand that was built by Timur. This is the wonderful domes. Remember that little dome we saw, the Samanid, the little brick dome? You could put another dome on. It was covered in wonderful tiles. So suddenly you had white, blue, turquoise outside of the building, outside and inside, magnificent splendor. Next. As you look at these marvelous buildings, you see the great artists of the Islamic world. Next. Gold leaf. This is all reconstructed, but it was there. And this is where Timur is laid to rest. And the last slide is this of the Registan. The Registan was actually a huge marketplace. And now we have 3 madrasas there, 3 different periods, all showing the magnificent wealth of Samarkand. And this was really the end of this part of the Silk Road. With Timur's descendants left. They left and they went to India. They were kicked out by the Uzbek, another tribal group that came in. But this is when the Silk Road really is ended, the land Silk Road. And we'll look at one more map. There's our road. We went from Chang'an through Dunhuan, Kashgar, up north, Bukhara, Samarkand. But there was no longer a Silk Road that was viable from about 1500s onward. But what was happening simultaneously was another road by sea. And that road by sea will now be expanded. From the 15th century onward, the Europeans came with huge ships. And most of the goods from that point on are now going by sea. But what's interesting is even today, there are wrecks found in Malaysia and Sumatra, in which Chinese ships, Arab ships, as early as 4th century AD, had goods on them, and they crashed, had shipwrecked. And one of the shipwrecks had 500,000 pieces of porcelain. And where was it going? It was going to the West. Porcelain. Everybody wanted porcelain. And there probably was also silk, but the silk disintegrates in water. But that's another whole story that you'll have to learn someday and go to Indonesia and Malaysia. But I leave you with 2 things. What is the legacy of the land road? Can I have the next slide? Because that really shows it. There she is, good Queen Bess. And she's dripping in Eastern splendor. Look at the pearls she's wearing. Look at the silk. And she's going to send her ships and her merchants eastward to bring back the goods. So it's her Muscovy company. Anthony Jenkinson goes off with worsted wool. He ends up with worsted wool in Bukhara. And the Khan was not that enamored with the worsted wool, but he did like the pistols. And of course, the last legacy from the Silk Road, from that the next slide will show us it, is this, the Taj. The Taj, whose ancestors are the Mughals. The Mughals that brought that tiny little Samanid mausoleum with that tiny little dome. It rose up and another dome on top. And that entry hall rises up, that doorway in splendor. And it mixes together not only Central Asia, but also India with the wonderful architecture of those chhatris in the top. And all this splendor, the mosaic tiles, is now going to be transformed into polished stone, inlaid. So all those artists and artisans from Isfahan, Damascus, China, all of these interconnections are here on the Silk Road. Thank you. Let's go. Right.
Diana,
Thank you.
thank you so much for that. That was amazing, hugely well, fascinating, comprehensive. I love your turn of phrase from Roman rave, talking about Lehman Brothers, Barbie dolls, rugby players, Mickey Mouse. There are some questions that have come in, but I think that you've been so thorough that you've answered a lot of them. And I know that Roy was asking about when you look at maps of the Silk Road, everyone is different, which is the authentic Silk Road. But I think that you've explained, articulated that there are many different roads. Trevor asked about some of the architecture that still is there, the monuments, and have they been recreated? And are there places, buildings where this is not the case?
Well, I think the one that definitely is not the case is the Samarkand, that little tiny brick building. That was found in 1930s. It was dug out of the sand. So that is completely and utterly complete. Unfortunately, the other buildings have been put back together because they fall, we're in an earthquake zone. Things fall apart. And especially like the Bibi Khanum Mosque. I mean, it fell apart as soon as it was finished.
Yeah.
So it's the elements. The elements are going to take things and it's just going to be like that. But there are bits on the buildings. There are bits.
Yeah, I've got a question about your favorite person. You obviously love him very much, and that's Alexander the Great. In that coin, you talked about, you referred to his horns.
His horns, yes.
They're the horns of Amun-Ra. But Amun-Ra is an Egyptian god.
He is. But don't forget, Alexander the Great, when he started his little wanderings, he went down to the Siwa oasis in Egypt in order to have the high priest of Amun-Ra, because it's only in Egypt, the pharaoh is a god. But he is a god, you know, because his mother said he was a god. So he goes down to the Siwa oasis and he is crowned pharaoh, and he is therefore a god. The pharaoh is the only ancient king who is actually worshipped as a god, not the other ones, not Mesopotamia, Babylonia. No.
There are a couple of practical questions. Jennifer asks about how suitable is the journey for the over 70s. I remember when I was leading trips there was a New Zealand lady who'd recently been widowed, and she was in her mid-70s. Her children had told her that she needs to brush her teeth with whiskey because she couldn't trust the Chinese water. This was some 25 years ago, and she believed that. But we were going up the Mingshan sand dunes, this sort of couple of 100 meters high, and she certainly kept up with me there. But she was very, very fit. But I think that, in short, the journey is, as long as one takes it slowly, is certainly fine for 70-year-olds.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
If you're fit, you can do it. Yes.
Yeah. There's another question about, can you travel the Silk Road by train?
There's parts that you do by train. You don't do buses all the way. You can't now. You have to go by. So from Kashgar, you take a train to the other cities.
Yeah. Okay. There's and I know that if you've got further questions like that, please call the office. Paul Craven is our expert here in the office on the Silk Road, and he would be happy to answer practical questions like that. A few people have been asking about whether they can access your slides. I know we've got a recording of this, but we will send that around. Graham and Susan also asked about what books you recommend.
Next one. Next
slide,
one.
yeah.
I knew this would come. Okay, Nadia, next slide, please.
I think it's there. It's there on screen.
There we go. There we go. That gives you a few things to look at. The one book that I would recommend is the first one by Frances Wood. She was at the British Library. She worked on the Silk Road project that's still going on. They're translating lots of letters, lots of manuscripts are still being translated as we speak, thousands of them. And the other ones by Susan Whitfield are larger books, lots of good pictures, really good pictures. They're really well done. And Susan also wrote this one small one called Life Along the Silk Road, which has each chapter is her idea of who were these people. So she writes a chapter about, you know, a priestess who lived on the Silk Road. It's fabricated, it's fiction, but it's lovely because she's using her artifacts. And then there's novels, stories, novels.
But the one you recommend is Frances Wood's one, is that right?
That's a good one. It's not too long.
Okay, great.
Now, what's interesting about people who write about the Silk Road, they do it from most of them are sinologists, they're Chinese specialists. Because there's two ways you can look at the Silk Road, one from China and one from basically the Central Asia. And we're just writing more from Central Asia. The Russians are doing more now because basically Central Asia really wasn't accessible because the Russians were there.
And when's your next book coming out on the Silk Road?
Well, I'll let everybody else write the books. I just want to keep going there. No, they're much better than I am. I can just introduce people to it. Thank you.
And thank you so much for that. That was, as I said, it was absolutely fascinating. It was hugely comprehensive, and well,
everyone's got to go. Just go, go, go. If you can't go physically now, get your books and start reading and make your list. And see you in Pakistan or the Silk Road or wherever. Bye.
Definitely so. Well, I just wanted three big thank yous. One is to Nadia, our slide mover honor. Secondly is to all of you for attending. But Dinah, a huge thank you to you. I think that was an amazing talk. And I'm sure that if anybody's got any further questions, then please do send them through to us and we can maybe get Dinah to answer them or do some sort of follow-up.
I'll do.
Thank you very much for joining us. As the slide here says, we will have a quiz in December. So please do join us for that. And obviously there'll be lots of questions on the Silk Road, and we hope that you can get 10 out of 10 on that section. Thank you very much to all of you. Have a very good night. Thank you.
Bye.